All right, so now we're going to be going over problem 4b, where we're writing this resize method, which will return a new two-dimensional array that only has the rows from this parameter that's passed in, array2d, that has all the non-zero values. Any elements in that new array should appear in the same order. So basically, we're going to be using our isNonZeroRow and this new numNonZeroRows method to build up this resize method, and we're going to be returning a completely new array that's built up from all the non-zero values in array2d. As always, let's go ahead and get started with our pseudocode so we can sort of figure out where to start. So the whole thing with this method is we're creating a new array. Our post condition is array2d is unchanged, and we want to be returning an array, a two-dimensional array. In that two-dimensional array, we're going to have to create a new two-dimensional array to store the non-zero values. Because this new two-dimensional array is going to be potentially smaller than the old array, than this array2d, we're going to have to figure out the dimensions of it. For example, let's say that one row out of the 3 rows in some two-dimensional array has zeros in it. That means that the new array that we're going to be creating and returning is going to have only 2 rows as opposed to the original array2d that has 3 rows. First, we have to figure out how many rows the new array has. Then we also need to figure out how many columns the new array has. And this is all leading up to actually construct a new array to hold the non-zero values of array2d. We've got how many rows, we've got how many columns, we've created that new array. Now we want to loop over array2d if a row is a non-zero row added to the new array. Otherwise, we don't need to do anything because we're also not supposed to modify array2d. We're just building up this array of non-zero rows. And then, since we've constructed this new array, we've put values inside of it, we've done all this work, remember that our method returns a two-dimensional array, so we also want to return the new array containing the non-zero values of array2d. And that should about sum it up for our pseudocode. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual code here. So figuring out how many rows the new array has. So as you might recall, within the description of the method, we are given this numNonZeroRows method. And what this gives us is the number of rows in array2d that contain all non-zero values. That should give us how many rows our new array should have. So this should be stored in an int. Okay, so int number of rows is equal to numNonZeroRows of array2d. It's another static method that you can just pass in an array and it'll spit back this int. We don't really need to care about how it does this. It's just a method that's provided to us for free. So let's go ahead and use it. Okay, so that's the number of rows our new array will have. Now we need to figure out the number of columns. Well, so the number of columns isn't actually changing. Okay, so for every single non-zero row, we're going to be adding in every value inside of that array. So our number of columns isn't going to change. So we can just grab the number of columns from the first row, and that will be equivalent to how many columns our new array will have. Number of columns equals array2d, and then just grabbing that first row. So that's an array. So if we want to figure out how many columns there are in that array, that would be equivalent to how many elements there are in that array. So that would be array2d.length. So now we have both of the pieces of information we need to construct a new array. Sweet. So let's call this is going to be a nested array of ints. So let's call this resized array. And then we have to initialize it equals new int. And then within these square brackets, we need to pass in first the number of rows, second the number of columns. So number of rows, number of columns. Just like I mentioned in 4a, this side of the statement is going to create a new variable that is a nested array of ints. Then this side of the equal sign is actually going to initialize it to have number of rows, and number of columns, number of columns. You need to have both of those to actually initialize and construct this new array. The second step of our pseudocode is looping over array2d. For this, we're going to do our bread and butter, our for loop. So for int I equals 0. Remember that two-dimensional arrays are row major. So for this outer loop, we're going to want to loop over how many rows there are in array 2D. This is a really important distinction. Since we're interacting with two different arrays here, make sure that the bounds of your for loops are what you actually want them to be. If I were to put number of rows here, that would be incorrect. The reason why is because number of rows might be smaller than how many rows the original array has, because this is the number of non-zero rows. What I'm going to want to use here is array2d.length, and then increment it. So now we need to figure out if a row is a non-zero row, and then if it is a non-zero row, we can add it to our new array. And oh man, if only there was a method that could pass in some 2D array and then the index of the row to figure out if that is a non-zero row. Oh wait, there is. Remember, we wrote it for part 4a. We can write a little if statement here. So is non-zero row, and then we pass in array2d. And we pass in the row index we're currently looking at, so that would be I. If this is a non-zero row, then that means we want to add it to our new array. But unfortunately, there's no method we can use to just sort of shift the entire row into our new array. We're going to have to go through it element by element. This is going to call for another for loop. So for int j equals 0. J is less than. Okay, so now that we're actually looking at the row by itself, J is going to be responsible for what column or what index within that array we're looking at. Here we can use number of columns, because this will give us the number of columns in array2d, and then we can increment it. So now we have two for loops, one that's iterating through the row, and then this inner for loop is iterating through the elements inside of a single row that we've determined is a non-zero row. Here's where we might actually want to add another element to keep track of what row we're currently looking at outside of our for loop. So I can do something like int current row is equal to 0. And the reason why we want to initialize this outside of our for loops is because these two for loops are actually used to iterate through array2d, but we need to keep track of what row we are modifying inside of our new resized array. And this is something that unfortunately we can't use I or j for. We want to set resized array at current row. We can use j here, however, because we've determined that there is the same number of columns for the resized array as there is for array2d. Resized array at current row of j is equal to array2d at I of j. And then once we're done adding every single element within the array to our resized array, we're going to want to increment current row so that the next time we find a row within array2d that is non-zero, we can add it to the second row within our array as opposed to overwriting the array at index 0 again. And make sure not to do this inside of the for loop, otherwise you're gonna run into an array out of bounds error. And make sure not to do it outside of the if statement, otherwise you're going to be incrementing current row even when you didn't add in a new row. So that should be about it for the logic inside of our for loop. So now we want to just return that array. So return resized array. And that is all the code we need to write for this resize method. As always, make sure to test it. In this case, we have an array that has 4 rows in it. Let's go ahead and see what our array looks like after we run it through this resize method. So the number of non-zero rows within array2d, if we sort of eyeball this, we can say that there are 2 non-zero rows within our array, right? Because the first array and the third array have zeros inside of them. So when we resize this array, we expect the array that we return to only have 2 arrays inside of it. And then number of columns stays the same, so this is going to be 3. We're creating a new array that has 2 rows in it and 3 columns in it. And then we're setting current row equals 0. Then we have our for loop, so I equals 0. 0 is less than how many rows are there in array2d? Well, there is 4. So as long as I is less than 4, we can go through our for loop. So we take a look at that first row, just 2, 1, 0. We pass it into the isNonZeroRow. These would be the parameters for that. Unfortunately, this is not a non-zero row, so we skip over this for loop and this other logic, and we move on to, and we increment I. So I is now 1. We're looking at the next array, which would be 1, 3, 2. We pass this into isNonZeroRow. This is a non-zero row, so we can go inside of this for loop. So now j is equal to 0, which is less than number of columns, which is 3. So we would set resized array current row, still 0. We haven't changed that value at all. J is equal to 0, equal to array 2D at 1, 0. What this means is we're setting the top left value of the resized equal to the first value in the second row of array 2D, which would be 1. And then we do that for the rest of the arrays. So we increment j. So now we're looking at the second element in that row, and then we increment it again to get that last element. So we've added in this row into our resized array. So right now, if we were to return it, this is what it would contain. However, there are more rows that we need to go through. So current row is now equal to 1, and we move on to the next array, next row. So 0, 0, 0. Unfortunately, this is a 0 row, so we skip this logic. We don't increment current row. We don't add it to our resized array. Okay, onto the last row in array 2D. This is 4, 5, 6. This is a non-zero row, so we set this value equal to current row, which is 1, this value equal to j, which is 0, this value to I, which is 3, and this value to j, which is 0. We're setting the first value in the second row of the resized array equal to the first value in the fourth array of array 2D. And just like before, we go through this loop, setting the values of copying over every value inside of that row into resized array. So we increment current row again, we add it to our resized array. So now we have 4, 5, 6 as well. We increment 4. 4 is no longer less than 4, so we're done with our for loop. And now we just return that resized array, and if we compare this to the expected return value, we see that it is correct. If we get rid of the pseudocode, here is what our final solution looks like, where we create that new resized array based on these number of row, number of columns values that we determine. We create a new variable used to help us figure out what row we're looking at in our resized array. We loop over array 2D, finding any non-zero row. If we find a non-zero row, we copy it over to our resized array, and then we return that resized array. So hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And as always, have a great day.